It's going to be over a month since the Ukrainian counteroffensive, which started from Izium and Kupiansk. This was Ukraine's big blitzkrieg in the south as well as the east of the country. It took the Russian forces by surprise, but it's only now that Ukraine's overall strategy is becoming clearer. Now, experts assess that the Ukrainian government's plan is to separately surround, cut off, and destroy elements of the Russian forces both in the south and in the east. Basically, what they're trying to do is to sever the immediate supply lines between the two flanks in the east and in the south. Russia could easily, up until now at least, move forces between the eastern and southern flanks. It has also run 24/7 supply lines between these two flanks. Ukraine's idea is to surround the two and cut the two from each other. So, a month on after this counteroffensive, is that strategy working on the ground? On Crux Decode, does Ukraine possess both the human as well as military capability to do exactly that? What is the evidence on the ground showing so far? And will Ukraine need a third offensive to make this strategy viable? And most importantly, what will the recent referendums and the annexations in these parts in the south and the east do to scuttle this plan of divide and rule? Mike Martin, a fellow at the Department of War Studies at the King's College in London, explained this possible Ukrainian strategy in a series of tweets this week. Here's how the war ends, I think. That's how Martin described the state of the current counteroffensive by Ukraine. Martin then went on to detail the two main efforts by the Ukrainian soldiers. In the east, outside the city of Kyiv, as well as further south in the Donbass region, particularly in Donetsk. Ukrainian brigades are continuing a series of encirclements and envelopments that began in early September. What they're essentially trying to do is to exploit gaps in the Russian lines. Now, these gaps have resulted from the Kremlin's hasty shifting of forces to the south and blocking Ukrainians' attacks north of Kherson. Now, Kherson is important because it's a strategic port city in the Black Sea. Russia has been occupying Kherson since March of this year. The Ukrainian eastern developments, which is first in eastern Kharkiv and then further south around Lyman and also in Luhansk, have badly damaged or destroyed major Russian formations. In fact, the internet has been full of videos that have gone viral of hundreds of captured tanks and fighting vehicles. All of this has unraveled Russian supply lines in the east. It's also disrupted the Kremlin's frantic and sometimes faltering effort to try and deploy hundreds of thousands of new troops. Remember, Vladimir Putin had given a call for 300,000 new troops in a partial draft that was announced a couple of weeks ago. The southern counteroffensive has been a little slower than the eastern one, and for very obvious reasons. Russian President Putin is deprioritizing and defending Luhansk in favor of holding occupied territories in southern Ukraine. And that is because Putin knows that the south is the key as far as this war is concerned. It is the avenue or the highway, as it were, into the Black Sea. Basically, Putin needs the south of Ukraine to get unhindered access from the Russian mainland out onto Crimea and further through the Sea of Azov into the Black Sea. Also, gaining control of the south would cut off Ukraine from access to the sea and to ports, thereby limiting its ability to keep trading routes open. But signs of Ukrainian advances in the south in the last few days are finally becoming evident. Ukrainian brigades have been rolling south along the Dnipro River. They've liberated a chain of settlements along the banks of the river, forcing the Russians back to Duchany. What this also does is open up the beginning of an envelopment, potentially thousands of Russian troops northeast of Kherson. The pocket that's forming on the right bank of the Dnipro will be used to try and suck in Russian troops as well as their assets to hold them there. If the Kremlin continues to prioritize the southern front over the eastern one, then Russian units in the east, which basically at this point of time lack the reinforcements that they've been asking for since early September, they could continue to collapse, potentially accelerating Ukrainian counteroffensive both in Kharkiv and in Luhansk. Now, to be clear, Putin prioritizing the south does not mean that the Russians are going to lose the east, or does not mean that they're going to win necessarily in the south. Ukrainian artillery rockets and saboteurs have spent the last few months trying to sever the main supply lines in and around Kherson. Pouring in reinforcements into this region without securing their resupply lines might just mean more Russian soldiers who are starving, and that means they are up for the Ukrainians to either kill or capture. But the biggest question, and what really matters, is whether and how these two operations, both in the south and in the east, link up. Right now, it looks highly unlikely that Ukraine will be able to successfully cut off the eastern and southern flanks from each other. Certainly not with the lack of success that we have seen in the south recently. So that means Ukraine will have to plan another counteroffensive. This time, an eventual third Ukrainian counteroffensive, one that has to launch itself from Zaporizhia. This is the city which houses the biggest nuclear power plant in Ukraine. It is exactly midway between Kherson in the south and Donbass in the east. And this is where MARIUPOL comes into play. MARIUPOL, of course, is a historic port city. The Russians destroyed and occupied the city all the way from spring of this year. The idea is that Ukraine, using its strategic reserve, will try to sever the Russian armed forces in Ukraine into two pieces which eventually cannot mutually reinforce each other. Which means, for this war to reach some kind of a decisive turning point, then Ukraine will be forced into a third offensive from Zaporizhia and MARIUPOL. Now, if it launches this third offensive and if it is successful, it could potentially cut off Russian troops from the east and the south. It will also give the ability to the Ukrainian troops to move both troops as well as supplies between these two flanks, basically do to Russia what Russia has been doing to Ukraine for the last few months, in fact, ever since this war began. A Ukrainian drive on MARIUPOL divides the Russian army in the south from the Russian army in the east. Each half would still have their supply lines. They would be able to feed their strategic rear areas. The garrison in Kherson should enjoy a trickle of supplies from occupied Crimea that in turn could arrive either via ship or by the lone bridge that connects Crimea to the Russian mainland. Forces in the east would still link to Russia, the Russian mainland, by railroad. But with the loss of MARIUPOL, Russia's southern as well as eastern forces will not have direct overland lines of communication. And that could mean the end of the Kremlin's practice of shifting forces between these two fronts. Overseeing two isolated forces in Ukraine would not exactly be easy on a day-to-day basis. It's all part of a Ukrainian plan to try and carve up the Russian army in Ukraine. What we are seeing is a Ukrainian operational design that's playing out across the south and the east. But right now, that plan remains just that. It is only a plan. This third Ukrainian counteroffensive has not materialized yet, and it's going to be increasingly difficult, especially after Russia annexed Zaporizhia recently, in fact has made Zaporizhia part of federal Russian territory and also made the nuclear power plant there a federal Russian unit. Any likely third offensive from Zaporizhia would be extremely fraught with risk. Now, likely also because the third option requires forces that are either ready or Kyiv is not ready to take this kind of risk because of the fluidity of the situation. If Kyiv is indeed planning a march on MARIUPOL in order to try and unify its earlier counteroffensives, then that march could have to happen right away in the next few weeks, or it'll have to wait until 2023. Now, that is because early winter in Ukraine is wet, but it's not cold enough to freeze mud into ice. Well, it's not for no reason that historically armies in Ukraine have almost always paused in November and December, and then they resume operations in the new year when there is a deep freeze. What happens as a result of this deep freeze is that there is solid ground, which means your armored tanks, your personnel carriers, they can all move smoothly. It is more likely to aid the movement of troops. So if a third counteroffensive is coming, it will have to come very soon, like I said, in the next few weeks, which Ukraine may not be ready for, or probably it'll have to wait until early 2023. Which begs a second question. What might Russia do with a 2-month pause? Can it generate enough combat-ready troops to try and stabilize these two fronts? That could complicate Ukraine's strategy. Does Russia have enough of manpower and supplies to do that in this two-month interim? That is something that we will closely track in this space.